Hey, so today, welcome to this Talk at Google with Jess Lee. So I'm Dan Cary, and joining me is Jess.
Hi.
She is a partner at Sequoia Capital. Previously, she was at Google as a product manager, and then Polyvore, which you joined as a product manager. You were then VP of Product, honorary co-founder, and ultimately CEO. Led the company through the acquisition with Yahoo in 2015. You were Fortune's 40 under 40 list, Glamour's top 35 under 35 women in tech, and a whole bunch of other things. So welcome. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So
Thank you.
so what's it like to be back at Google?
It's trippy. It's very surreal. I used to sit in this building in like 2005, I think, when it first opened. It's kind of cool to be back. I learned a lot of things on this campus. I was in Apm. And I worked on Frugal, which was product search back in the day. And then after a short stint there, I moved to Google Maps. But this was when Google Maps was a desktop product and we did not have smartphones. So it was a pretty long time ago.
So you joined Polyvore right from Google, right?
Mm-hmm.
And It was kind of a weird journey, right? Like it wasn't normal circumstances for leaving Google and joining a company.
I would say it was a little bit of an unusual path. So I remember I was sitting at Google in my office with another Google Maps PM. And he was like, hey, you should check out this site called Polyvore that my friend is working on. And I was like, okay, I checked it out. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. What Polyvore does is it lets you mix and match and create outfits out of real products. And you can create those outfits and share them with your friends. It's kind of like a fashion magazine created by a community of women all over the world, but everything is shoppable. So I fell in love. I started using it 2 or 3 hours a night and just couldn't get it out of my brain. And then because I was a PM, I had a lot of complaints about the product. So I wrote them all down and I sent an email to the co-founder and one of the founders. And I was like, hey, I love this product. I think it's going to be huge, but can you fix this? And here's some suggestions for how to fix them. And then he wrote back and said, hey, these are all great suggestions. Why don't you just come work here yourself and fix all this stuff yourself? And so that's what ended up happening, and that's how I ended up at Polyvore.
So you filed a bug report and got them assigned to you.
Yeah, kind of.
Polyvore is fantastic and awful. My wife used to work at Polyvore and joined Polyvore for the same reason, because she needed to pay for all the stuff she was buying on Polyvore. So it's a very good site. So what was it about Polyvore that caught your interest when you were using it?
Yeah.
Like what clicked? What made you so passionate about it?
So before getting into computer science and Google and all that, my original goal in life was to be a comic book artist, and because I really love to draw. Ended up not working out because my parents wouldn't let me go to art school because they're Asian. And they thought it wasn't like a legitimate career. But what drew me into Polyvore was the ability to self-express. It was a creative tool ultimately, and it was kind of at the intersection of art and fashion and technology. So I thought, wow, how often does something like that happen, where it pulls together a lot of your passions? It's something that's at the very earliest stage. So if I went there, even though there's not a lot there, I would get the opportunity to learn a ton, which has actually reminded me of the Apm program. I got into the Apm program thinking like, okay, I don't even know what a PM is, but at least if I come here to Google, I'll grow and I'll learn. And maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, but at least I would challenge myself and grow. And that's exactly how I felt about Polyvore. I was like, there's nothing here. Maybe I can volunteer and step up and do some of those things, and I'll grow a lot. And that's what ended up happening. I actually kept volunteering to do various different things at the company. I was like, oh, let me write the blog since we don't have a marketing person, or let me answer the phone when the advertisers call because we don't have a sales team. And then what ended up happening is I would try that job, learn just enough to be a little bit dangerous, like just enough, and then figure out I wasn't very good at it, and then hire someone else to do it. But having done it myself, I was a little bit better at finding the right person to hire. And then that person would inevitably end up reporting to me because I was the only sort of business person at the time. And then we just kept growing, and eventually all the departments were reporting into me, except for engineering. And my title was still VP of Product. And at that point, we decided to make the switch where I became CEO. So very unusual path to sort of running a company, but that was mine.
That's really interesting. And in that time, was there anything that you came across that you were like, no way, can never do this, huge mistake, way too dangerous at this?
Yeah, that was like every day. I mean, startups are incredibly hard, right?
Yeah.
It's every day is a new obstacle. And I definitely felt like, especially since I was growing quickly and the company was growing, every time I felt like, okay, I've got it now. I figured out how to do my job. I think I might have figured it out finally. That feeling would like inevitably only last for a brief moment, because then the company would get bigger and then everything would change all over again. New people, the process that was perfect for communicating with 20 people broke at 50 people. And then once we got that right, it broke again at 75 and then at 125. And then, it's just things. When you're growing, things just keep changing. You just kind of have to get used to the feeling of constantly not knowing what you're doing, or not knowing how to do something, which is essentially the same thing as learning.
Yeah.
So you should kind of seek. I've always felt like you should seek out that feeling. You should try to find that really nauseous, horrible feeling of I don't know what I'm doing, because that's how you know you're getting career growth.
And then was there anything while you were kind of the CEO of Polyvore that kept you up at night? I mean, what was your biggest worry while you were doing it?
Yeah. So specifically, there were so many things. Product market fit. Was our product serving the users well? We were very, very community driven, and then figuring out like, is the market that we're in big enough? Do we have to evolve the product? Lots of hiring. Especially later, all the issues became very much related to like people. So did I have the right VP of sales? Did I have the right VP of engineering? Were these people clicking? I mean, there were so many moments, and strangely, they all felt very existential, because I think when you're running the company, your identity becomes intertwined with the company's identity, and every bump in the road feels very, very personal, which is part of what makes startups so hard. Yeah.
So I was kind of stalking you on your Sequoia page before this, and you talk about grit a little bit. You talk about being able to create delight and overcome obstacles, just kind of sticking with it. I'm sure everything wasn't always like on the up and up, and it's a startup, so there's tons of times where you feel like you're dying.
Yeah.
So any advice for people in terms of developing grit? Is it something that's innate and you just kind of have to express it, or is it something that you practice over time?
I definitely think, some people start out, there's this concept of distance traveled. Like when you're looking at, say, an interview candidate and you look at their resume, I think if you look at the distance traveled, like where did they come from and how far have they gone, that's actually a good metric. That's how I really think about grit. Like if you started at an easier place in life, like more privileged, maybe your distance, your distance traveled might actually be less than someone who had none of the privilege. So I think sometimes your upbringing and where you came from, that original distance travel to get to where you are, actually increases your grit sort of naturally. Like it could be your family circumstances, it could be your socioeconomic classes. But on top of that, I think grit is something you actually develop over time. And the way you do that is you push yourself to travel further. You get used to just forcing yourself to do things that are hard, that feel bad, that nauseous feeling of learning that I was talking about. And that's actually what increases your grit. Because grit is really pain tolerance, right? So if you can put yourself into those painful situations and those challenges rather than kind of taking the easy route or coasting, that's, I think, how you develop grit. And I think grit is one of the most important ingredients in startup founders, because it's just so hard. You don't control so many of your circumstance, right? You don't control what happens with the market. You can't control the fundraising climate. You can't control what all the people on your team, decide to do, or if there's a competitor that comes along. So you really have to have grit, and you have to practice at getting stronger and stronger to put up with all the ups and downs.
So is that something you look for now that you're on the other side of that funding table, now that you're at Sequoia?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a combination of grit and passion, right? Like to get through the pain of just the basics of starting a company, you either have to really care about the problem and be mission-oriented, or you have to have that natural grit. But there has to be something driving you, right? Because on average, it takes, I think, 8 or 9 years to build a company from ground zero to a successful outcome, like an exit or a large M&A. And so, to imagining that amount of time, like it has to be something you probably care about.
One of the other
grit to power through all the problems.
Yeah. One of the other things that you mentioned on your Sequoia profile and a few other interviews that I've seen with you is you talk about focusing on one thing and doing it really, really well.
Yeah, that was one of the core values at Polyvore, yeah.
Do one thing.
Mm-hmm.
So how has that one thing kind of changed? I'm sure being a wannabe comic book artist, being an APM at Google, being at Polyvore and all those different roles, it's changed a lot. How do you kind of pick that one thing?
Yeah, I think when I was a PM, one of my strengths was actually empathy, was being able to think, what does the user want in this situation? Like as they're printing out their driving directions on Google Maps, back when we used to print driving directions, because remember, this is desktop days. What are they thinking? What do they want? And that empathy helps guide a lot of, product decisions, right? But then as you become, then I became, I transitioned, and at Polyvore I started answering the phones for sales calls. Then the empathy was applied to, what does the advertiser want? And like trying to research and understand enough about the advertising industry to imagine, okay, it's not just this is an advertiser. The person that I'm talking to is an account manager at a large agency who is trying to advance their career and wants to do good for this client. The client probably thinks this way, and being able to take all of that and figure out what the right ad product was. Then as the company got large and I started managing people, it was, what does my team care about? Like, where is this person in their career? How do they feel about the current state of the company, their team, their career goals? And now that I'm on the investor side, again, that applies to, trying to understand the founder and then trying to understand the market that they're in, the users that they're serving, what do they care about, right? So I would say that, at first I thought, my one skill is actually product design and product management. Then I looked a little bit deeper and I realized it was probably something to do with empathy. Yeah.
Do you think that's just the key for consumer businesses? Is empathy kind of across the board? Is that the thing to nail?
Not necessarily, because I think, with the help of amazing user researchers who can tell you, like, these are your three personas of, the three types of users that you're solving for. Like, you can actually, if you're an analytical smart person, if you have that data given to you rather than having to imagine it, you can still be a fantastic product designer. I think the key with great consumer design product design is creating like a kernel of delight, right? Like it's not enough to have a product that like solves a problem and sort of does what people ask you for. You have to go way above and beyond, and there has to be this moment of like, whoa, I didn't expect that, or that was amazing, or unexpected, to the point where you would bother to tell a friend, right? Like you're like, a good example is actually Snapchat. When you do the filters and you do one that's the face swap, right? That's really clever because I didn't expect that inside some sort of chat app. And then it's inherently viral. Like I will sit there and show it to my friend, like we'll do it together. And that's a moment of word of mouth delight. So I think the secret to great consumer products is you have to grow, right? And you're growing. If you're growing organically, it's because people are talking about you. And the way to get people to talk about your product is to do something above and beyond that's really, really delightful. So that's how I think about it.
So what do you think the most important thing was that you worked at while you were at Polyvore? And I'm wondering if you knew how important it was at the time.
Yeah, I don't think I did, but it turned out to be culture. In the beginning, when you're starting, the product you build as a CEO, as a founder, is the product, the service that is delivered to your users. But then, as the company grows, your attention actually, you get further and further away from the product because you're not the one writing the code anymore. You're not the one making the day-to-day decisions. You're managing through a team, and the product actually starts to become the company and the organization. And the same way that you instrument your product and measure, is this feature working or not? You A/B test, or you carefully, you put Google Analytics on everything. You actually have to do the same thing with your company and your team to make sure it's healthy. Like, are you measuring your employee engagement scores? Are people happy and thriving? Like, is code being checked in? Like, you actually have to pay a lot of attention to how people work together. And most importantly, the culture is basically the operating system. So it's about building the operating system for the company, which is the culture, and then all those metrics and things that you monitor. And the larger and larger you get, the more and more important it becomes, because you need people to be aligned on how to behave. And that's something I've always thought was really great about Google. I always felt like there was a clear culture when I was here, and it was measured and defined and really cared about and thrived, and everyone knew what being googly meant. And I think that's part of why Google has always been successful.
So did you just fork Google culture, bring it over to Polyvore?
No, actually, I made some. There a lot of it's the same, right? Like the empowering engineers to make decisions, empowering product people, and try to be a little bit more bottoms up, or at least that's how it felt when I was here. I copied a lot of that. But the one thing I did not copy was and I think you can't at a startup, is you have to be very cognizant that you're on a clock and you're running out of money all the time, right? Google has one of the best business models in the world, right? And is basically AdWords and AdSense are printing money in the basement to power all kinds of amazing projects. Now that's, evolved to Android or many other business lines, but that luxury of, we need to just purely focus on, building the right product and not have to worry too much about revenue, which was the case. It's probably changed since then, but that was certainly the case when I was here. I could not copy that over to a startup where you had 24 months of runway. And it's not even just the runway of money you're funding, it's also the runway of people's time and patience, right? If you're underpaying your team and because they're not at Google or Facebook, then you have to make sure they see like a path to success. So I think being much more conscious about spend as well as urgency and people's time was a big part of our culture that I would say was different than Google.
So a couple things I keep hearing is learning, people, caring. Are these the things that motivated you? Has kind of your motivation been the same across being an APM, being a CEO, being at Yahoo, being at Sequoia?
Personal motivation. I think I care about two things. One is impact, like what kind of impact are you leaving? What sort of dent are you making in the universe? And the second is just personal growth and learning, right? I found that if you optimize for learning, then you think about success and failure in a different way, because sometimes you learn the most in the toughest situations where you are most likely to fail. So if you reframe that conversation into am I learning or not learning, and learning is success, then you stop thinking about whether you're getting the A or the C, or whether you sold for $1 billion or 100 million. Like you just stop thinking purely about the outcome, which makes you afraid sometimes because you don't want to risk what you already have. And then the other is impact. One of the things that I really loved about Polyvore was had this very democratizing effect on fashion. It was about letting a community of women all around the world say, no, this is what I think is stylish, and I don't want to listen to the fashion magazines telling me this is what you're supposed to look like. And for the women who used it, it was very empowering. And that allowed them to, when you feel like you look a little better, then you might feel a little bit more confident. And we had so many girls from school age to girls applying to college to older women just talking about how it helped their confidence. So for me, that was always part of the mission. And then part of the mission for me at Sequoia is, venture is probably 7% women. And that I think has downstream impacts on the percent of women who start companies and the percent of innovation that happens in fields targeted at women. And then that affects execs and, all the way down the chain. So I thought, maybe if I could move into venture and change the ratio just a little bit and help back, amazing founders, both men and women, but I might be a little bit more inclined to understand some of the female founders who were working on products targeted at women, which I was at one point too. So that's on the impact side.
So how are you approaching your role as a partner at Sequoia now? I know it's still relatively new, but anything where you're like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be focused on this. I'm going to provide this value to people.
Yeah. So I think the investors that do the best are probably the ones that are actually helpful to their founders. So I've tried to focus on where can I be really helpful? And some of those areas are in consumer, right? Because that was what I did. My whole career has been mostly in consumer. I'm also starting to look at some spaces like AR and VR and robotics. I spent a lot of time meeting female founders as well. I've been looking at direct-to-consumer brands, which is fairly new for venture and for Sequoia. Those are some of the areas that I tend to focus on.
In any kind of niche fields that you're kind of geeking out about, excited about?
I'm pretty excited about robotics. I think now that computer vision is of age, computers can see. You're seeing a lot more tech moving out of the phone. Instead of it being in a little screen or on your desktop, it's moving out into the physical world. And maybe basically it's sort of the intersection of it's all the tech that we know from the internet moving from pure bits into the world of atoms, right? So maybe the earliest version of this might be something like DoorDash or Instacart, where or Google Shopping Express, right? Where it's not just software and, are my bugs okay? It's like software and then, oh my God, all the problems of the real world. Like the driver was drunk or missed the delivery or the food's cold. Like these are not things that software can catch, right? Which is why I think a lot of these companies are run by hardcore operational people who just know how to grind it out and have a lot of grit, because it's not beautiful, elegant software anymore. And I think you're going to see more and more of that as we move into fields like robotics and more automation in the real world.
You realize that you now have to combine fashion, robotics, and I guess Google Maps somehow.
Yeah, I have not seen that pitch yet, but that'd be pretty cool.
I'm sure it will come up. So before I ask you about the most important thing that you're working on at Polyvore, but what's the most important thing that you're working on today, if you're aware of it?
The most important thing? I think at the end of the day, like Sequoia's mission is to, help daring founders build really legendary companies. So the most important thing is to find those people and help them. I've done 2 investments. I spent a lot of time with those founders, and one is a seed, one is a Series B, because I'm on the early stage team. We do everything from seed to basically Series B. Is every day is just trying to figure out how to help them. And then the other piece is, I've been working on various initiatives to try to figure out how to help female founders more. So there'll be more on that probably in a few weeks.
Okay. Yeah, I know you've been doing a lot of talks lately. Conference a couple weeks ago for women in tech.
Yeah. I love going to those events. It's so amazing to see all the activity and the excitement.
So when you were running a startup, when you were talking about product market fit, how did you know when you nailed it? I mean, Delight won't give you product market fit, it will give you virality. How do you know that you're actually providing that value early on?
So I actually do think that when you found Delight and you found product market fit, that you do start to see organic growth. You do start to see that word of mouth. You're right, there are moments where you're seeing that word of mouth for other reasons, like maybe you had a really viral piece of content on your platforms. You have to be able to figure out how to distinguish that. But generally, I think organic growth means that you've found product market fit. The question, though, is how large of a market is it that you're working on, and how, you can have product market fit for some very tiny sliver of a market or for a particular user, and you have to be able to distinguish, like, is that enough? Is this enough for a sustainable company or not? I think that's the biggest lesson that I've learned on the venture side is, I can assess the match between maybe a user and a product, but thinking through the market structure, like, is this a good market to be in? Are there tons and tons of competitors that are the platform companies most likely going to dominate the space in the long run, and therefore your tech will be commoditized? Thinking through those kinds of issues and market size and market structure has sort of been one of the biggest lessons. Yeah.
Any tips for learning that stuff other than joining a VC firm and thinking about it 40 or 80 hours a week?
Yeah. I think this is maybe something I didn't do enough of as a PM is competitive analysis, right? Like, look through what other people, like, you should obviously figure out what's great about your product, but you also have to think, like, when I say Delight, when you're going above and beyond what people expect is set by what's available in the market, right? So just because you solve their problem doesn't mean you're going to win if there's another product that also solves their problem but has much better distribution than you do, right? So you really have to think about that line of what people expect being set partly by competitors, right? A good example of this is when all the smartphones came out, right? Before that, like, BlackBerry was the best phone, right? It had a keyboard, you could do your email. And then when the iPhone came out, that was just, I don't need a keyboard. Like, I can browse the entire web with this. It just reset everyone's expectations. And it took, a lot of companies died during that because they didn't catch up and they were just focused on what they were doing, right? That you have to think about who else is innovating out there, what are they doing? So I would say spending a lot of time on competitive analysis, and then also thinking through, here's where we are now. Where will we be in 5 years? Where will my competitors be in 5 years? And then skate towards that, skate to where the puck is going, not to where it is right now. So just getting really good at thinking about that. Is I think the most important thing.
And I'm guessing that advice holds true for CEOs, for basically everybody.
Yes.
Okay.
I think that matters a lot for founders and CEOs as well. Yeah.
Does stage matter there? Like, should early stage startup founders be worrying about their competitors, or should they just be focused on delight and value, like you said?
I think you still have to think about it. It's not something you spend like every day obsessing about. Like, I don't think you can be constantly looking behind you looking in the rear mirror, but you have to know what the baseline is, and you have to have a sense. And that's part of how you set your strategy. And then you just focus on getting to that point, but you have to make sure you do those checks periodically. Maybe it could be once a year if you're smaller. It could be every quarter if you're larger. But it is really important to have that to check the expectations of the market on a regular basis, but focus most of your time on actual execution.
I'm really curious what you think about the early stages of community. Obviously, Polyvore had a really good community. It had a good company culture. Do you see differences between how you seed culture internally at a company and how you seed it in a product?
I think I think it's best if they're somewhat aligned, because if they are, then I think it comes across more authentically. For the community, what we did is, the same way that we cared about our individual employees, we cared about our community. When we would have a community event, we would do a few things well, rather than having a massive conference where we couldn't really spend time with people, and we also didn't have the money for that. We chose to have smaller meetups, right? So we got 20 people to come to New York Fashion Week with us. And we threw a beautiful breakfast for them. We took a couple of them to some shows. We tried to give them the tickets instead of us going. Our community manager went through all their Polyvore profiles and picked out products that they had used regularly, and then bought them. We got our advertisers to just give us swag, like free stuff and coupons and shoes or whatever. We packed them into these bags. And I remember we had these breakfasts, and some of these women would open it and just start crying because they were so happy. And it was just, the immense delight was amazing. And it was just such a bonding moment for those teams. And then they went on to talk, to the other community members about it. So it was great for us. It's hard to measure whether that was really like an ROI positive investment, which is sometimes how people think about community, but I think that's just not the right way to think about it. Think about Zappos, right? Zappos has an amazing reputation, and that's because of, good customer service, but also those stories of the woman who wrote in or was on a call with a Zappos person for an hour talking about how, she had a whole series of life events and therefore needed to return the shoes, and they let her return it, and then they counseled her for an hour and then gave her something. I don't know. I don't even remember the lore anymore, but that's the point. All I remember is there was a story and it was amazing. And that's part of what cemented, I think, the brand for Zappos.
Do you think people are focusing, founders, as much as they should, on culture today? You see a lot of these really big, scalable networks that don't really have an identity to them.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's easy to just be obsessed with winning and not think about culture. And that's fine if you're always winning. People love to work at companies that are winning. That's a huge part of it. You can't just have an amazing culture and then drive your company into the ground. You have to have both. But I think some companies have prioritized winning over that, treating people well. And that works as long as you're on that upward trajectory. But as soon as the going gets tough, I think people start to look around and question, and they're like, why am I here again? I'm being treated horribly. And then they start to bail. So part of culture and creating that right operating system is it smooths out the bumps in the road, right? Because when the going gets tough, which it almost always does at a startup, right? There's always going to be something that goes wrong. You get to keep your team together for just a little bit longer. They have a little bit more loyalty, a little bit more patience, and that extends that runway that I was talking about. Because it's not just a runway of money and not being able to pay people. It's a runway of people's patience, right? As an employee, you have a million things to choose as a job, right? If you're great, you can come work at Google, you can come work at Facebook, and then you get paid more too. But they choose to work at your startup, and you have to figure out how do you get that little bit of extra loyalty when the going gets tough? So I think culture is very, very important, and I think in general Silicon Valley does really focus on culture, and every kind of culture. There's essentially culture is, it can be extreme. That's fine, right? yeah. But I think treating employees right is really, really important.
So if you weren't in tech, let's say you're not at Sequoia, let's say you're banned from the tech industry forever. Are you gonna go become a comic book artist? Like, what would you do?
That's a good question. I don't think I would make it as a comic book artist. I don't think I'm talented enough, but I might give it a try anyway. Yeah, or professional cosplayer.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Can we touch on that? Because that's divergent.
Yeah, well, I love anime, and I mean, I cosplay now, like, rarely, but yeah.
That's pretty fun.
Yeah.
So you were at Yahoo for a bit of time. You were at Polyvore for a very long time. You were at Google for a bit of time. Those are three companies in relatively similar spaces, at least parts of them. What was it like working across them over time? Did you have to adapt yourself to provide the most value, provide the most impact, or was it more of this is what you bring to the table, here's how you can influence the group around you?
Oh, it changed a lot. So Google, I was, an APM, fresh out of Stanford computer science. I had never led a team before. I had no idea what I was doing. I never had a real job. And you come into that situation with a bunch of experienced engineers, and you're like, how do I get these people to listen to me at all? Like, I have no credibility. So there, I remember I was like, how do I get them to respect me? I know, I'll fix a bug. So I just checked in code and tried to prove that I was useful and that I was willing to work hard, and slowly built that relationship with that team. But it was all about rolling up your sleeves and like getting stuff done. When I had the credibility, I was able to lay out more of like the product roadmap. But everything was very, very in the weeds, and working with the team, making decisions myself. At Polyvore, it was early days, very similar, right? Like, they hired me, and I didn't have to work so hard to earn the respect, but it was a lot of in the weeds, making decisions, writing code, all of that stuff. Then when you switch into becoming a manager or VP or moving up in the org, you are no longer focused on the solution. You are focused on the problem, right? And the art, I think the reason why no one really likes micromanagers, right? And what's annoying is that the micromanager is the person who's trying to tell you, here's the solution. Let me tell you, like, do it this way, do it my way. And what you really want is an explanation of like, no, this is the problem we're trying to solve. The reason I don't like your solution is because you didn't think about this part of the problem. So if you just articulate the problem clearly and the guardrails of like, what's acceptable and not, then people start to come up with the solutions that are a little bit closer to what maybe you think is ideal. And even if they don't, you have to still accept it sometimes, but because they could be totally right. I've been proven wrong many, many times, right? As I'm sure we all have if we're managers. But that just keeps changing as you grow in the org. So you start with a solution creator, then you become a problem creator. And then at some point, no one tells you anything. There's no problem given to you, and you don't have to articulate. You're just, here, you are a VP at Yahoo. Create value for our company. And then no one tells you, so we invented products, right? So that's a very different way of thinking. But I would say that was the difference between all the different roles and stages. Yeah.
So did you approach that by trying to find problems for people, or did you just try to find teams and then say, bring me problems you think are important?
Yeah, so I set up I was the VP of the lifestyle group, and we knew that to create value, we wanted to build a bigger mobile user base for Yahoo, because it was still quite homepage desktop centric. I actually had a lot of Yahoo weather's amazing, but still more mobile growth, and we wanted lifestyle, which to me meant a younger audience. And a lot of women. So then what we did is we started outlining like what are the verticals that we could go into: health and wellness, fashion, beauty, social. And so we picked verticals, and then what we did is we started to build out user personas. What are the different types of people in this space, and then what are the problems? And what I did was I didn't tell them, here are the people. I know exactly like what women 13 to 25 want. I said, here are the parameters of those users. Come up with a process to understand these people. And then the team got really good at that. They got great at creating user personas. They became amazing at coming up with a brainstorm. Erica was involved in this, actually, your wife. She's awesome. And they would run a process with the team to brainstorm different products. And then we came up with a process for how to test that very quickly. And then what we ended up doing is creating a process to get apps shipped in 8 weeks. So we would brainstorm, and then 8 weeks later, we would push something to Android. And it would be an MVP, but we'd get enough data, and then we'd do 2 or 3 more iterations. And there, we actually shipped, I think, 4 or 5 apps inside of Yahoo under some, umbrella company. So it didn't say Yahoo on it because we didn't want to risk the brand. But it was like a great, fun thing for the team to work on. For various reasons, well, we didn't ship all of them. Some of them actually sucked, and some of them had interesting traction, but we ended up deciding they weren't strategic. And the one that eventually launched was Cabana by Tumblr, which is a live streaming group watching app. I think there's a lot more work to be done, but I think that's sort of how we manage that process, or how I manage it as the VP while wanting to empower the team, but also making sure we were doing something useful and strategic for Yahoo.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, and these were teams of 5 people, so 3 or 4 engineers, and then a designer and a PM. So very small team, 8 weeks. Yeah.
So we do have a Dory with some questions, and we also have a mic in the back. So the Dory link for anyone on the live stream is go/ask-Jess Lee. But why don't we bring this up and take a few of these? Okay, so what's the difference between being a PM at Google and being a CEO at a startup? And in your case, did you see any challenges during that transition, and how did you get over them?
Yeah. So I think I've mentioned some of that. The culture and the environment in terms of like having to think through revenue very early on was different. At Google, the responsibility was much more about the product and less about the people in the org, or the product became the company at the CEO stage. It was a challenging transition. Like I said, I constantly felt like I didn't really know what I was doing, and the job just kept evolving underneath me. Then I'd figure it out, and then it would change again. So, yeah.
Okay. So you've been on both the building and financing side of products and businesses. So which would you pick?
Oh, that's a tough question. There are pros and cons to each, right? On the building side, as a founder and a CEO, there's a lot of existential stress, right? Because your identity becomes the company, and you're constantly worried about, are we going to make it? I've brought 125 people with me on this journey. Like, what am I, is this going to work out for all of us? So it's much more existentially stressful than being on the investor side, where the value of your work is spread out across a portfolio of companies versus all your risk tied to one single company that you are responsible for. So existential stress is much higher on the founder side. I do miss getting my hands dirty, right? Like writing code, making product designs. I get to do a little bit of it with my earlier stage companies, so that scratches that itch. I would say, though, that the learning is enormous, and that's a huge upside by being an investor. It's such a privilege to meet so many amazing founders working on so many different markets. Like every day I learn something new about the latest, greatest state of some technology or a market that I wouldn't have known anything about. And it's just a privilege to meet all those awesome people and to just constantly be learning.
So a lot of times people, you always hear don't identify too much with your work, but you see people do it all the time. Do you think that's actually a useful thing for startup founders to be doing? You said as a startup founder, you sometimes see people's opinions of the startup being a reflection of your work. Is that a good thing to care that much, like to be that invested?
I think there's certainly a personal sacrifice that comes with it, but part of me also feels like it's necessary in order to get through it. So, yeah, I think it's a little inevitable. Like if you're too checked out, you don't really care what happens with your company. Like I think it's hard to actually tough it out and make it work. And I feel like I've been making startups sound really terrible, which is not, right? It's just that it's epic highs and epic lows, right? And the epic highs made it all worth it. Like I had so many moments where I was like, I can't believe this is my job. I've found my calling in life. This is amazing. I love my team. Like this is the best feeling in the world. And then also moments of like, oh my God, why did I leave Google? Right? But that's just par for the course. And I think it's like that for every founder and every CEO. Yeah.
So why don't we take a live question in the back?
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming to Google. It's a really interesting talk. I have a question. Did you come across in Sequoia any interesting fashion tech companies?
Yeah, I have seen a lot. The problem is I know where all the dead bodies are buried because I did fashion tech. So they actually say that a lot of times investors are less likely to invest in things that they know too well. So I feel a little bit like that. Let's see, what have I seen? I think there's a lot of interesting computer vision stuff that's happening now that enables fashion companies. Fashion is one of the hardest recommendation problems, right? Like, Netflix had the whole Netflix prize for figuring out movie recommendations. But if you think about it, there's not that many movies. Like, how many movies come out per year? Not that many. And then how much does your movie taste change? Versus fashion, it's like not only does your taste change over the years, like trends change, seasons change, and then, the amount of product out there is astonishing, and it's very difficult to describe, right? Like little touches like silk or white stripe here, like it's just so unstructured. It's very difficult, and people like very specific things, and so it's one of the most difficult problems. So there's some really interesting computer vision companies that are, classifying products that look similar, and I think that's a very interesting space. I think you do a lot more once you have vision.
Okay. Another question in the back.
Hi, Jess. Thanks so much for coming here. I'm Nishant, the PM in Search.
Hi.
One of the things I'm curious to know a little bit more about is how did you balance having a focus versus writing a blog, being the marketing person, being the salesperson, being the product manager, and so on and so forth. Can you touch a little bit more on that?
Yeah. So what I tried to do was I always had my core duties of product management, and then I tried to only do one new frontier thing outside of that. So I was not writing code and doing ad sales and the blog at the same time. I did the blog first, and I was like, oh, there's a lot of community stuff to do here. Let me hire a community manager, and then she took over that. Then I think after that I moved to ad sales. I did it a little bit, then hired a great New York Times salesperson. And so they were more it's one extra thing. Yeah.
How many people were at Polyvore when you joined?
Just the founders, so 3. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And when you left?
125.
Okay, so a little bit bigger.
Yeah.
Okay, another question in the back.
Hi, Jess. Two of the things that you talked about being very important to you were having a big impact and kind of doing a lot of learning, like cross-disciplinary areas. Mm-hmm. It kind of seems like at a company like at Google scale, it can be hard to have as big of an impact on the thing that you're working on, and also to kind of be given those additional responsibilities, or even to be able to seek them out yourself. Mm-hmm. So do you have any advice for trying to find those opportunities when you're in a bigger company?
Yeah. It can be harder, for sure. What I would recommend, and what I think I ended up doing actually inside Polyvore as well, was just go do them. If you see something, come up with the solution, mm-hmm. or do a little bit of that work and then bring it to the person who maybe owns that area or might be a manager. Be like, hey, could I work? Look, I already did some work here. Yeah. Can I, prove to them that they should have you helping them before you ask them, can I help you, right? Just go ahead and do it. So that was a big part of my journey. I think that works anywhere. In terms of impact, Google touches so many people, though, that even when you own a small part of something, you might still be as impactful as working on a huge thing inside of a company with many fewer users. But I think autonomy is maybe one of the key differences between small startup and large company. So that one's very hard to I think you just have to pick where you want to be. Yeah.
Thanks.
Mm.
So another question from the Dory. It's part of being a CEO and a PM is making hard decisions. Can you share an example of one of these really hard decisions, how you approached it?
Yeah. So let's see. We pivoted our business model twice. And then that's probably, those were hard decisions. And then other hard decisions were probably when people had to leave, right? I would say one thing that's interesting about startups I didn't realize until I went through it is there are people who are just awesome at the early stage, right? They love being one of 10 people. They're so good, they're jacks of all trades, and they just love the freedom and the autonomy. And then as the company gets bigger, they start to feel really like encumbered and they don't like it anymore. And you keep trying to make it work because you just like love that person. But really the best thing to do is actually let them go free and find the next company. So those were some of the hardest decisions because I was like, why isn't it working? Let's just make it work. We'll just like rearrange the universe to work. And it just doesn't work that way. Some people are just great for different stages. So I think that was a hard one. The other one was, like I mentioned, just pivoting. Sometimes there's pull there, like your business model is not working and you're not making money and you have to do something else. So those are difficult to roll out to a team, right? Like if a whole group of people work on this particular business model and are no longer needed, right? Like that's very difficult, but you have to do the right thing for the company and for the greater good of that group. Yeah.
Now that you are evaluating new companies, potential investments, and potential founders that you're looking at, do you consider that when looking at founders? Like, is this person great in the beginning, but I worry about them in the long run, or is it too hard to predict?
It's pretty hard to predict. Like, honestly, I think if you met me, like, before Polyvore, you might not have assumed that I would have been able to get to the larger company stage. I'm more on the introverted side. I hate public speaking. Like, it's, I don't think you would have said that person can definitely scale to run, like, have VPs and stuff reporting into them. So I try to be very, very open-minded about that. And I just look for that grit, right? Like distance traveled, like, can you keep pushing yourself? Do you have a history of pushing yourself? Because you might be able to push yourself all the way through. Because it's not rocket science, right? It's hard, but it's a lot of trial and error and just learning on the job. So that's more what I look for. Yeah.
Any advice for introverted PMs or founders?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think you can be a great leader even if you're very, very introverted, right? You might not be the highlight of a cocktail party or something, but who cares, right? At the end of the day, you have to be able to convince your team of what the vision is. You have to be able to rally them. For my all hands, I really hated speaking in front of the whole company a lot. So what I did is I actually had a lot of the other folks on the team speak and explain what they were doing, right? Which is actually nice because people like other people like being in the spotlight. They like getting credit for what they're doing instead of me talking the entire time. That was something that I did, and it was, I was still able to have lots of really meaningful, great one-on-one conversations or smaller group conversations. And because I didn't like public speaking, I would always have slides, right? I love to draw. I'm a designer, so I would make sure that whenever I was giving a talk, I had a beautiful set of slides so that everyone would be looking at that instead of at me. And that helped. It made me less nervous. And it also, I think, was a guide for what I needed to say. And you just find your tips and your tricks. I think you can be a great leader as an introvert or as an extrovert. Yeah.
Why don't we take another question from the back?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Jess.
Hi.
I was wondering if you could share your most recent public investment and I guess like what drove you to actually invest in that team.
Yeah, so it's in stealth. So I can't share it. Maybe I can tell you a little bit about what they do. So this company is an on-demand staffing platform. So they match workers, blue-collar workers, to jobs or shifts at companies like Target or Uniqlo or at a warehouse. They're live in like 8 different cities, so it's not just a San Francisco problem, but there's a lot of people there's a lot of unemployment in this country, and some of it is actually due to inefficiency. So they are a marketplace that matches people. Really great, hardworking, humble team. They continue to do jobs on the weekends themselves just to make sure they don't forget what it's like. And a lot of distance traveled with these founders, so I really love their grit. Yeah.
Well, I guess kind of a follow-up. Do you think that there's a trend of, I guess, like a lot of startups that focus more on middle America and like a lot more blue-collar things that tend to succeed and might be harder to find as an investor since like investors tend to be in like the Silicon Valley bubble or like New York, stuff like that?
Yes, I do think that that's true. It's something I think about a lot. Like, I think, is this thing gap widening? Or does it help with obviously, we're not pure impact social investors. Like Sequoia is where it is and has been for 45 years because it produces tremendous returns consistently and has backed legendary companies like Google or Apple or NVIDIA and Airbnb. And it is important that it does drive performance and drive returns, but those are things that I think about, and I think there are a lot of untapped opportunities, and I think that the company I just mentioned falls perfectly in that realm. Yeah.
So why don't we take one more Tory question? It's what is something that Google can learn from other companies? Now that you're back here after like a decade, what lessons have you brought back for us?
Huh. Wow, I mean, it's hard to tell Google, like, hey, you're not doing very well, because that's clearly not the case. I thought it was very clever to break out Google into multiple companies to give more autonomy and breathing room and leadership for a lot of people. I thought that was a very, very clever thing. So I guess that's more something that other companies can maybe learn from Google. And I think that comes from maybe caring about, that growth and investing in people. Or maybe there's financial reasons, I don't know, but that's how I thought about it. Let's see. I do think the focus, the one thing that I had already mentioned was just knowing that you have a runway and that sense of urgency. I do think that sometimes that can be really helpful forcing function. Like when you're in a meeting with someone for the third meeting about the same topic and you can't get everyone to agree and you're trying to get consensus, sometimes it's good to think like we have 6 months to live, right? Like, should we be arguing about this right now? Because I think getting rid of some of those extra meetings would make people a lot happier, probably. So maybe that's my one thing.
And then why don't we take one last question from the back, and then we'll wrap up.
Right. Thanks. Thanks for a great talk, and thanks, Dan, for organizing it. So first, let me apologize by saying that I've never been to Polyvore site, and so please pardon me. So I understand that the users were a big component of your product design and success of the company. And sometimes, but users get too powerful. Sometimes there are power users that troll the entire user community.
Sometimes there are power users?
Yeah, there are power users within the segment
Sure.
of the users.
Yeah.
They troll everything. Was this the case in Polyvore's case that you got blindsided by what users were saying in some certain cases, or where you had to take decisions against what the users were asking for?
Yeah,
I would like to hear that thoughts.
Yeah, I think knowing your users and listening to your users does not mean doing everything your users want. Because sometimes they ask for things that just don't make sense, right? Like if every user was a product, designer, then we'd all be, designing products and we'd all be rich entrepreneurs. So you have to listen to, when they say I want something, you have to think, okay, you're giving me a solution. What was the problem you were trying to solve? And then you have to remember that for every vocal user, there's a ton of silent users out there, which is why for us, personas were very important. So we had clear personas for the different types of users. There was the creator who made all the content and was constantly asking us for features and talking. And then there were the more casual shoppers and browsers, and we had personas for them as well. So I think you use user research plus talking to your users, plus personas and all these other tools to get a sense of how much to prioritize across your entire user base. But yeah, definitely don't just listen directly, do everything that they say.
Okay, let's thank Jess for coming. It's been great.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, Dan.
Okay.